As I mentioned, it's our great pleasure to welcome Professor Nicholas Cull, Professor and Director of the Master's Program in Public Diplomacy at USC, and also the Center on Public Diplomacy. He joined the University of Southern California from the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom, where he was a Professor of American Studies and directed the Center for American Studies. Cull's research and teaching interests are broad and interdisciplinary, centering on the developing academic discipline of public diplomacy, the role of culture, information, news, and propaganda in foreign policy. He's a very prolific author of some very well-regarded books, including Selling America, U.S. Information Overseas, which is a history of the U.S. Information Agency. And his first book, Selling War, was named by Choice magazine. It was one of the 10 best academic books of 1995. He's the co-editor of Propaganda and Mass Persuasion, a historic encyclopedia from 1500 to the present, which was one of Booklist magazine's reference books of the year, and co-editor of Alambrista and the U.S.-Mexican Border, Film, Music, and Stories of Undocumented Immigrants in 2004. Cull is president of the Council of International Association for Media and History and has worked very closely with the British Council's Counterpoint think tank. From 1992 to 97, he was a lecturer in American history at the University of Birmingham. While a graduate student, he studied at Princeton University as a Harkness Fellow of the Commonwealth Fund of New York. He received both a BA and a PhD from the University of Leeds. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nicholas Cull.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you, Virginia. Thanks for hosting me here on this beautiful campus on this lovely day, and I appreciate you're all coming out to hear me when I know your exams are coming up and you've probably got other things that you could be doing, so I hope it's worth your while. Can you all see? Okay? Good. I'll just check the clicker works. What I want to talk about today is to explore the concept of public diplomacy and its related concept of soft power, and to look at the way in which the concept links governments, people, and their foreign policy, what is going right in public diplomacy, what has worked in public diplomacy in the past, and maybe some places where we need to reconsider public diplomacy in looking to the future. The image there is the face of contemporary American public diplomacy, Karen Hughes. And I'll begin my presentation by talking about what is public diplomacy, giving you some basic definitions so that when we move over to discussion, it'll be from a shared definition. I'll then talk about what is soft power and look at the relationship between those two concepts, and finish up by asking what the lessons might be for the United States. So first of all, what is public diplomacy? Well, before we can define public diplomacy, I think we need to define diplomacy. And diplomacy I would define as an actor's attempt to manage the international environment through actor-to-actor contact. And usually, of course, the actor we're talking about is a government, though diplomacy in this day and age is no longer the monopoly of governments. International organizations, NGOs, and non-state actors also have diplomacy and, by extension, public diplomacy. So if this is diplomacy, actor-to-actor contact happening typically in private, public diplomacy is an actor's attempt to manage the international environment through actor-to-people contact across international frontiers. When an actor is connecting to their own constituency, the people on their side, we call that public affairs. And there's a difference between public diplomacy and public affairs. We can go into that maybe later on. An example of public diplomacy would be an institution like Radio Free Europe broadcasting from this country to the people of Eastern Europe during the Cold War. Components of public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is an umbrella term which includes within it 5 core components of activity. Now, the first of these components is listening. Logically, before you can speak to somebody, especially if you wish to persuade them of something or manage the environment through your communication with them, you have to listen to them first, so that you understand where, what the needs are of that particular situation. Now, the concept that listening has a place in statecraft is not new. It's not unique to the concept of public diplomacy. You can go as far back as ancient China, 480 BC, and you have the thinker Sun Tzu saying that the leader has to know the enemy, has to understand the enemy's thought process, and that is an exercise in listening. Today, listening in public diplomacy is carried on through activities like government polling. This is a poll done by the Pew Trust, which illustrates the points, showing favorable attitudes towards in Nigeria towards the United States and other countries. And the point of the poll was to show that America's problem in Nigeria is disproportionately with Muslims. Other countries don't have the same image problem with that specific community. Advocacy, the second element of public diplomacy, also goes way back in history. If you look at Herodotus, he has an account of ambassadors from the Persian ruler Xerxes, recently pictured in the movie 300. And I can say the real Xerxes was not a 7-foot-tall, cross-dressing, body-pierced person of unusual proclivities, but quite a noble statesman. Anyway, Xerxes sent out ambassadors to the Greek state of Argos to tell the people of that state that they shouldn't go to war with him when he invaded the Greek archipelago because they shared a common ancestry through the hero Perseus. Now, that's a very interesting decision to take. And the idea of connecting to a people rather than just to a single ruler was necessary because it was the people who made the choices in that Greek city-state. So it's an ancient example of the advocacy element in public diplomacy, trying to persuade people to understand a particular policy, to follow a particular course of action. Today, advocacy would be conducted through something like an embassy, press conference, or an information center, or a similar activity. The third component is cultural diplomacy. This is when a state seeks to extend its culture internationally, hoping for some benefit to follow to that state. An ancient example of this would be the way in which the Byzantine emperors worked with Orthodox missionaries like St. Cyril, pictured here, to extend the Orthodox faith across the steppes of Eastern Europe and thereby carry political influence. In fact, the political influence of Orthodoxy and the Byzantine state were overlaid and can still shape the map of Eastern Europe today. A contemporary example would be the way in which Russia has sought to promote its international interests by sending ballet overseas. The idea was that if people associated Russia with ballet, this would replace an association with communes, state-run factories, queues for bread, and such things. Exchanges are often grouped with cultural diplomacy, but I would argue that an international exchange is something different for reasons that I'll come to in a moment. An example of ancient international exchanges would be the way in which in Northern Europe, both Celtic tribes and Scandinavian Nordic tribes would exchange children, so that one tribe would foster the child from another tribe and would learn the skills associated with that tribe, the way of life, the culture of that tribe, and then might be exchanged or back as adults or used as sort of ambassadors as adults. And this was a very powerful way of creating community within these regions of Europe. Today, we have international exchanges, such as those founded by Senator Fulbright. The reason that an exchange is different from a cultural diplomacy initiative is that an exchange is typically, and some would say necessarily, mutual. You're always taking something back for your country, giving something to another country, and you assume that both sides are learning. Whereas with cultural diplomacy, quite often it's a bit like the Olympics, saying, look how fantastic my ballet dancers are, yours can't dance for toffee. That is a difference. The final component of public diplomacy, I would, under this scheme, is state-funded news. And an ancient example would be the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who used to send a newsletter around all the courts of Europe so that the entire population of the major centers of Europe would know what he was thinking and doing. Of course, today this is done through international broadcasting. An example of this would be the BBC World Service, located in London's Bush House. What the United States contributed to this map of public diplomacy activity was not to originate these activities, of course not. What it contributed was the term public diplomacy, with its suggestion that these things had enough in common to be housed within a single agency or funded through a single budget or subject to a single policy. And there is an argument, which we could go into later on if you wish, that in fact that is a mistake, that these functions are all important, but they are mutually exclusive. And how can you have a one-way activity like listening, where the information is coming from abroad into the country, housed along with an activity like advocacy, where the information is coming from the center outwards, exchanges where you've got a two-way process going on, or you look at state-sponsored news where everything has to be separated from advocacy so the news is credible, or you look at the way in which cultural diplomacy also has to be separated from advocacy to be credible. So you have problems within the essential structure before you've started talking about how public diplomacy operates. From my point of view as a historian, it's been frustrating to see how lumping these together causes disputes, but the flip side is that it means that whenever people get angry within the public diplomacy bureaucracy, they leak like a sieve to the newspapers. So just when the archive runs out, I find that there'll be a really important memo on the front page of the New York Times that will fill in the gap in putting together a story of the history of American public diplomacy. Now a little bit of historical background on the rise of American public diplomacy. The term is inseparable from the career of America's public diplomacy agency, which was the United States Information Agency, founded in 1953 by President Eisenhower to draw together into a single organization all of the activities in the field of international information that have been set up during World War II or during the early years of the Cold War, to give them a bit of structure. The term public diplomacy was not the term was not coined for another 10 years when the chap in the picture, Ambassador Edmund Gullion, devises this term to name a new center that's being established at Tufts University. He coins it quite explicitly as an alternative to the word propaganda, because the word propaganda had so many negative characteristics associated with it. America needed to be able to say, those Russians do propaganda, we, democratic Americans, do public diplomacy. And to be able to develop, I think quite sincerely, a democratic approach to international information. It was embraced by USIA as an argument for expansion. USIA saw that there was a substantial overlap between its activities and the concept of public diplomacy, such that if they promoted the term, they might get to own the entire field. The bits they didn't own at this point were the cultural work, which had stayed at the State Department because Senator Fulbright didn't want his, in quotes, exchange program being used by a propaganda agency. And they wanted to use public diplomacy as an argument for maintaining control over Voice of America, where the journalists were always looking for increased independence. It wasn't used outside the United States until the 1990s, when, as a result of the success of public diplomacy in encouraging reform in Eastern Europe, in connecting to political change in Eastern Europe, the world shifted and people looked to public diplomacy as one of the explanations for why this had happened. But ironically, at the very moment that the world takes notice of public diplomacy and other countries establish public diplomacy bureaus or public diplomacy departments within their foreign ministries, the United States neglects it. America, or elements within the United States, people within the Senate who might possibly be Senator Helms, come up with the idea that America needs a peace dividend, that government should be downsized, and that really America's message can be carried to the world by CNN and commercial channels. And this means that during the 1990s, USIA is neglected, it's downsized. In the end, it's folded into the State Department, where public diplomats become second-class citizens in a very tradition-bound institution. Today, scholars have introduced a new concept called the new public diplomacy, and I'll say a little bit about what the new public diplomacy is. It is a response to the new environment of the post-Cold War world. The new public diplomacy includes new players, such as international organizations like the UN or the European Union, NGOs, which have outreach programs, and CEOs. By that I mean corporations now are acting like states. IBM has a bigger budget than many countries, not only in the underdeveloped world, but in the developed world too. And this is producing a new map of public diplomacy with many, many more speakers and many more players. There are new methods of public diplomacy, methods that couldn't have been dreamt of 20, 30 years previously, such as the internet, connecting people in new ways, and a new diplomatic context. Instead of the old bipolar world where the Russians and the Americans are dueling with each other through the tools of propaganda and public diplomacy for the minds of the masses, now you have the United States as this great surviving superpower and everyone else around the edge, but communications happening around the edges in new and different ways. You have new directions in public diplomacy. Public diplomacy during the Cold War was very much top-down. The president spoke, USIA disseminated it. And though there are exceptions to this, tends to be the way things were at least conceived of. Today, you have to conceive of public diplomacy as being much more horizontal. Communities around the world connecting to each other in international networks, and the government facilitating those connections. With this new world, there's a new vocabulary, and the key term of this new vocabulary is soft power. I'd also say that this world is producing new jobs as each of the players in the world of public diplomacy need smart people with advanced language training and a good background in international relations to work for them. So this sounds like exactly the sort of field that some of you graduates of the center would be interested in. New public diplomacy, new definition of public diplomacy. And I would say that the new public diplomacy is an actor's attempt to manage the international environment by facilitating people-to-people contact. So the emphasis is moving towards the people and away from the government, but it has to have your government or your actor imagining things, initiating things for it to be diplomacy. Origins of the concept of soft power, next. The concept was coined by Harvard professor Joseph Nye in 1988, and he did it to find a way of expressing the importance of the quality of attractiveness of a country in its international relations. He used this concept to refute the argument that had been advanced by Professor Paul Kennedy that the United States was in a period of, or heading into a period of relative decline. He said America was bound to lead. Its soft power was such that no one else on the planet could rival it. It was embraced as a way of explaining the political change in Eastern Europe. The idea was that America's culture, America's values were so attractive that Eastern Europeans cashed in their values to buy into American values. Unfortunately, it was widely misread as being economic power. And maybe there's a little bit of a comment here that people thought that attractive values and being rich were the same thing. It's a mistake that a number of people you run into make, that they don't understand those wealth and character, wealth and values are not the same thing at all. Some more definitions. Power, I define as the ability to influence others to get what you want. Hard power is the ability to get what you want by using or threatening force or inducing compliance through rewards. This is both the carrot and the stick. Soft power is different. It's the ability to get what you want by attracting followers through values and culture. So, in the old picture of the child seeking to encourage a donkey with either a carrot or a stick, the soft power response would be to show the donkey a movie about how great life is for donkeys who work for you, or sing the donkey a song about how much better off it would be if it was a donkey on your farm. It is outside of the realm of carrot and stick, and it also assumes a more sophisticated audience than donkeys. Hard versus soft power. Types of power. We've got behaviors, resources here. Hard power includes behaviors such as commanding people to do things, coercing people, inducing them. The resources you use for this would be force, your armed forces, economic sanctions, payments, and bribes. Whereas in soft power, you're attracting people through your values by being who you are, explaining who you are. You co-opt people, and you use your moral force to establish an international agenda. At the moment, Tony Blair is seeking to use his moral force, such as it is, to get the world thinking about climate change. That's the #1 British public diplomacy goal at the moment, is to, especially in this country, is to get people thinking about climate change and building what Britain calls climate security. The resources you have are the resources that exist within your culture, your values, your culture, and the choices that your government makes. If you've got good policies, you will have more soft power, you'll be more attractive, And the flip side is, if you've got bad policies, you will be less attractive, less powerful, and repulsive in to use the opposite of attractive. Here are some real-world examples. Soft power explains something that we all know about. You don't have to have an army to be significant in the world. Napoleon used to say, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" rather dismissively, but we know that the Pope is a significant player on the international scene. He is a player as a moral force. So he can speak on a subject, and it will make a difference. Maybe not as big as a difference as he would wish, but it certainly wouldn't be true to say that the significance of the Pope in world affairs is equivalent to the physical strength of the Swiss Guard, with their frilly pants and pikes that he has patrolling St. Peter's. Another moral actor would be Nelson Mandela, somebody who, not by their representing a moral institution, but rather by being seen as having led a moral life, is able to speak on an issue internationally, and people pay attention. Nelson Mandela is an international resource for South Africa. How might history be different if Mandela had been born in Zimbabwe? What would Zimbabwe be like, and what would South Africa be like? We don't know. But the fact that Mandela is South African is a resource for South Africa. The second example from the real world. Soft power is increasingly significant because hard power is harder to use. Hard power looks messy in a world of real-time television. This is what Israel found out the hard way last summer. You cannot now use hard power without looking really bad on the world's television. It may be that we have reached a point now where it is impossible to win a war through hard power, and where to lose a war is actually the more attractive thing to do. We may be through the looking glass, because certainly last year, Hezbollah, by any metric, lost that war in Lebanon. And yet, equally, by any metric, they won. They were clearly ahead in terms of international support, in terms of their objectives at the end of that war. So things have changed significantly. Soft power has to be at the center of the major decisions of international relations. Soft power is a surprise resource for some countries. Thailand was amazed that it was gaining international traction because people liked its food. And the Thai government came up with what they call restaurant diplomacy, the idea that they should actually promote Thai food around the world and encourage the development of Thai restaurants because people who'd eaten there had a more positive opinion of Thailand. Now, this will not work for Britain, but it is oh God, this is being podcast, so heaven knows what I could be attacked by British restaurateurs as a result. Having said that, there's also this world of negative soft power of deeds and words, and deeds like the treatment of prisoners in Abu Ghraib being made public damaged America's soft power. Words from characters like the recent Secretary of Defense damaged America's soft power. He may have been a person who played well at home. Maybe Americans liked him and felt stronger, safer, more confident when he was saying, we don't do negotiation, we don't do listening, we don't do dialogue, we just go and kick whatever. For foreigners, he was a deeply alarming person and did America a lot of harm. What we need is smart power. Smart power, a concept that is being developed by Professor Ernest Wilson at the University of Maryland, is a fusion of hard power and soft power. It's public diplomacy built into your military and your economic policy. It is listening to the world so that you're taking world opinion into consideration before you do something. It may be that the best role of public diplomacy is to say, not this is how you should spin policy X, but rather world opinion is such that you shouldn't do policy X. Don't invade that country. Don't go for regime change. Instead, work with an international organization. Work through a coalition. Maybe that would be a sound public diplomacy policy based on listening. Maybe that would be smart power. Is public diplomacy the same thing as soft power? Well, they're very closely related and they occupy the same sort of territory, but they're not the same thing. Rather, they're overlapping dimensions of contemporary international relations. Soft power is a static resource, a terrain on which diplomacy is conducted. It exists in the perception of people. The people of the world either regard your values well and accord you a certain power because of their feeling, or they don't. Right? Public diplomacy is a dynamic activity which exists in the policy of the international actor and which can leverage the soft power, can seek to build it or to correct the government policy to maximize the soft power, but they're not exactly the same thing. The difference is, I think, fascinating. Here are some states. States can have a public diplomacy policy without soft power. Anybody think of a state that tries to project its image around the world and yet has nobody respectful of its values? North Korea. One of the most powerful radio stations in the world is Radio Pyongyang, but nobody pays any attention to that at all. States can have soft power with no public diplomacy policy. Any suggestions? Republic of Ireland. Ireland, everybody loves Ireland, right? And yet Ireland spends nothing on cultural diplomacy. Maybe they have a film festival every once in a while, but they have no equivalent to the British Council. They have no Irish cultural centres run by the government. People do that for themselves. Every major city has an Irish cultural centre, generally sponsored by Guinness, and called a pub. And people go into these places and commune with imagined Irish ancestors, and Ireland has tremendous this tremendous resource of everybody loving it. And it doesn't matter that Ireland doesn't help you out in your wars. We English have to go and British have to go and do that. But everybody still sort of loves the Irish and dresses up on St. Patrick's Day. And that is soft power without public diplomacy. States can have soft power, no soft power left, and very poor public diplomacy. And this, unfortunately, is the state that Israel is in at the moment. And there's some wonderful scholarship by my friend, the Israeli scholar Eitan Gilboa, looking at what Israel should do to rebuild its public diplomacy, because once upon a time Israel had a very powerful public diplomacy policy that they called Hasbara, explaining, but they have squandered that resource today through incautious hard power use. Soft power, then, is a resource that is accessed through the use of public diplomacy, and an example would be the way in which the United Nations operates, seeking to explain itself to the world, seeking to use people's regard for that international organization, generally the regard of people outside of the United States, but people abroad, regard for the organization, and that is a resource for the UN, getting things done, and making the world a safer place. What are the lessons of soft power and public diplomacy for contemporary American foreign policy? Well, the first lesson is that public diplomacy matters. Yet America spends so little on its public diplomacy. If you just take cultural diplomacy, America used to spend $1.50 for every American on cultural diplomacy exchanges and so forth. Now it spends $3. Most civilized countries spend $8 for every member of their public on these sorts of activities. France spends $18. Now, there are particular reasons why the French spend that much. They feel that if the world doesn't speak French, then France will lose influence. But shouldn't America, as the world's only superpower, care that people have a realistic idea of what its culture is and don't trust the producers of Baywatch to do that for them? Second point, listening matters. There was a reason why my taxonomy of public diplomacy starts off with listening. It has to all come from listening. We have to listen first and then speak. But so much speech in international affairs today seems to come from listening to the wrong people, listening to the domestic audience and speaking with a view to what will get you elected in 4 years' time, not listening to the international audience and saying what will help your foreign policy, get your objectives realized, and save the lives of your military personnel. To use the term crusade when you're talking about an enterprise in the Islamic world, it was so stupid as to be beyond belief. It reflects a culture of speaking, maybe even without thinking, but certainly without listening. Third point, openness matters. No country can go into a relationship with world opinion believing that it has all the answers. When you're out socializing, if you run into somebody who wants to be the only person in the interaction doing the talking and thinks that they could transform your life but has no openness at all to learning anything from you or any mutual transformational learning happening, you wouldn't stay long around that person. Why should it be any different with states? Admitting, in the world of soft power, admitting weakness is a great asset. Hurricane Katrina was a wonderful opportunity for the United States. It could have said, look, we're suddenly face to face with our problem of race, problem of class, and problem that we don't build very good levees. Let's talk to countries where people are also thinking about problems of race, problems of class, and where people actually know how to build good levees, like, for example, the Netherlands. It would have been a wonderful way of having an international forum. Wasn't done that way at all. It was seen, Hurricane Katrina, oh my goodness, it shows American weakness, therefore let's just say, no, it wasn't our fault, and carry on and talk about something else. Fourth point, time matters. Success in public diplomacy is long-term. You can't expect, in the jargon of Washington today, to move the needle and get a success overnight. You have to invest for generations. Chinese public diplomacy has a planning horizon of a century. American public diplomacy has a horizon of the next budget cycle, or at most 4 years. And it is terrible for public diplomacy officers in the field to have to work under those situations. In public diplomacy, you have to give a scholarship to a school student today who will, 30 years down the line, be a cabinet minister. That's the way public diplomacy works. And the people at USIA were amazing talent spotters. They spotted Margaret Thatcher as a future world statesman when she was just in her around 30 years old. They brought her to the States, brought her around to a way of thinking that was compatible with American conservatism. And established a resource that the Reagan administration could cash in on 20 years down the line. Look for the long game. The fifth point is that individuals matter in public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is about relationship building, and its great strength lies in its attention to individual, in caring for individuals. Equally, if you bring somebody into your country as an exchange student and neglect them, it may well be that you will be merely giving credibility to a negative witness. And there are examples, again, I can talk about this in a moment, of people who came over as exchange students who went back to lead anti-American movements because they weren't properly looked after, or their exchange experience became an echo chamber of their own prejudice. Now that's very, very rare, but it is a danger. You cannot assume to know me is to love me. 6, information matters. If America doesn't give correct, authentic, reliable information about itself, other people will fill the void. Maybe they will be religious fundamentalists. Maybe they will be merely the things that the tides of global capitalism wash across the surface of the globe. Maybe it'll be rap musicians or pornographic film producers. Who knows what turns up in around the world as their sources for American culture. The 7th point is that dissent matters. America's system is attractive because it permits dissent, because it permits a plurality of views, and one of the best things this country can do is not send one congressman overseas to lecture to the world about how great America is, but send 2 to debate each other and to show that this is a system which can cope with differences of opinion. If I was George Bush, I would have sent Michael Moore on a world tour. A, it would have got him out of the country, but B, it would have shown that this is a country which values its dissenters. The Clinton administration had an idea of this. They sent Daniel Ellsberg, the Vietnam War dissenter, on a tour of China to talk about how it was to be a dissident in a democracy. Now, that is the sort of public diplomacy that can make a real difference, I believe. The 8th and final point is that success matters. When the United States drops the ball in its public diplomacy, the whole free world, the destinies of everybody who cares about freedom, who cares about the Western way of life, is in jeopardy. America is in a special position as the world's only superpower, and for all our futures, we have to work together to make the sort of connections between people that are necessary to build real security for our world. Thank you very much for your attention.
We realize that some of you may have to leave for classes in just 2 minutes, but we do have some time for questions.
Sorry, Corey.
No, you're fine. You're fine. If you have questions, please wait for the microphone as we are recording, and welcome your questions for a few minutes.
To what extent would you say McDonald's, for instance, influences this country's public diplomacy, just our international marketing corporations?
I think that's a very important point. And corporate public diplomacy is a whole developing subfield of public diplomacy. The thing that people miss is that when corporations are actors in the international environment, they're not necessarily international actors for the United States. McDonald's is primarily an international actor for the McDonald's Corporation. And we have to start thinking of McDonald's as being a state in its own right, which has interests that sometimes overlap with the United States and sometimes don't. McDonald's public diplomacy is often in the cultural field. What McDonald's will do is they'll look at a country, study its culture, and then give sponsorship to local culture so that they are associating the McDonald's brand with local cultural expression. So they're local rather than global. For example, you might go to a tribal dance in New Guinea and find that it's McDonald's or Coca-Cola who are sponsoring that event. Coca-Cola in Europe sponsor that most tribal of European events, soccer matches. So whilst corporations sometimes align themselves with the government and say, we need good American public diplomacy to create a pro-American environment in which a very American brand can operate, and McDonald's sometimes says this, equally, you have corporations trying to make their own way in the world and sort of cutting loose. And I found even right back in 1947, when Truman got together the big exporting corporations and said, now I want you to toe the line expressing my containment policy to the world, Procter & Gamble put their hand up and said, excuse me, in the UK, Procter & Gamble is seen as a British company. Why would we want to associate ourselves with American foreign policy and lose that local connection? So I think that's an excellent question, but it gets us into a whole other realm, and I hope that at least gives you a flavor of the situation. Yes.
Would you like to see a return in the U.S. to the old UAIS way of doing things?
Yep.
USIA.
That's a very good question, and a lot of the lobbying around American public diplomacy has been couched in terms of bring back USIA. Unfortunately, it isn't going to work like that. The resource of USIA really was squandered. The people who had the on-the-ground connections, who knew the editors and the intellectuals in each of the cities around the world, when USIA joined the State Department, they didn't just go into State Department jobs. They took early retirement. They have not been replaced by equally skilled people because priorities have been different. One of the good things Karen Hughes has done is to try and reassert public diplomacy within the State Department, and it has a increased credibility now. Everybody is required to tick a public diplomacy box in terms of their evaluation. You'll be evaluated according to how you've done in public diplomacy when they're doing your end-of-year report on you. And that makes a difference to a Foreign Service officer. If it affects how much they're paid, they're going to pay a lot more to attention to public diplomacy. I think that whilst I've spent a long time studying USIA, I've spent 12, 13 years now studying the agency, I think the agency had problems. And rather than reestablish USIA, what I would do would be to establish an independent agency for each of those subdivisions within public diplomacy, probably to bring together culture and exchange into a cultural and exchange agency more independent from the State Department than the present Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, more on the model of the British Council. British Council has been able to operate in countries where there's a state of effectively war between the UK and that government. People accept the British Council is not the British government, the same way they accept the British Broadcasting Corporation is not the British government. And I think that's a strength that America could play into. And I would like to see each of these elements built up in independence. But the real need is for money to be spent. If nothing else was done, but that the budget of public diplomacy was increased so it were equivalent to the per capita expenditure by other countries, that would do so much. It's not rocket science. It's not rocket science. Laura.
I was wondering if you might touch upon your thoughts about the distinction between public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy.
Right. I see citizen diplomacy, as I make clear in my definition, public diplomacy is necessarily an extension of state policy, whereas citizen diplomacy can exist even where the state has no concern or has an opposite policy. It's possible for citizen diplomats to organize exchanges, to express themselves where there is, in a place where there is no American public diplomacy. For example, an American business visitor to Iran might make an effort to explain America, to engage as a citizen diplomat with a country that is off limits to conventional American diplomacy. So I see citizen diplomacy as a great strength, and maybe the greatest untapped resource of American public diplomacy is the people of the United States. And the more that America can connect its people as they really are to the rest of the world, the better. Its people are its great resource. Its weakness probably is in the way in which its leaders appear.
I'm sorry to cut short this great example of public diplomacy. Professor Cull has another visit at 1 o'clock, but we can take one more question.
Well, one of the things that concerns me is, and you put your finger on it for the foreign countries, that we used to identify people that would be very successful, people as cabinet officers. What do we do in the United States, maybe to identify and develop a diplomatic corps that would be sophisticated and accomplished in the very things you've been talking about? How do you go about that?
Well, at the risk of lapsing into a, what do they call it, an infomercial, what we did about it is we established a master's degree at USC to train public diplomats, both from the United States and from overseas. And there are programs now coming online at University of Syracuse and soon at George Washington University. And these programs are both empowering young Americans and training young Americans, but also, equally importantly, to train people from other countries to speak to America will be a way of creating a better informed foreign policy climate in this country. Because I see one of the major problems as a general failure of young Americans to know that much about the rest of the world. And America as a country needs to learn to listen. It's very hard to teach somebody to listen. It's much easier to teach somebody how to speak. And so I'm hoping that by improving the skills of all public diplomats, there will be a better conversation in which more people are informed and in which a wider section of the country will reach the sort of levels of understanding of international affairs that I know are commonplace at BYU, because I run into your graduates all over the place in the circles of power and of scholarship.